behalf of the squadron, I want to welcome Christina Olds. I hope that all of her books have already been sold, and she has some more projects on the back burner, front burner, and she's a busy woman. So I think we all should owe her a round of applause for coming and showing up and taking her busy schedule and slipping us into it. So thank you, Christina.
Thank you guys for inviting me. And you know, when you're running through the categories of people in this room, I recognize the one I fit into. I'm a groupie. I'm a groupie of all of you guys. And I became a groupie, well, I was my dad's groupie for years. And I had no idea that this would end up being my passion in my life. And it has been, for the last 10 years. And it just keeps getting more and more and more fun. And also more and more and more important, especially when I sit there and I look at these three kids who are about to start flying and know that our future, I think, is in really good hands. As much as people can be negative about what's going on today, I continually meet wonderful young people that are giving me the faith that we're going to be fine. We're totally going to be fine. So, what I'm going to do is tell you the story of a boy who loved to fly. And I think you'll all be able to relate to that. All right, well, that's the cover of the book, and I'll tell you about that photograph when we get to that point in the slides. So my dad was the product of an amazing military father. Major General Robert Olds was my grandfather, and I'm actually working on his biography right now because in many ways he was far more important than my father. My father was a great fighter pilot, a great leader, and a renegade, and he's sort of like the Braveheart, iconic fighter pilot guy that's out there right now. But Robert was at the forefront of aviation and at the forefront of establishing air power. And he was the, well, let me just get to that photograph.
Right button.
Robert Olds was the first commander of the very first squadron of B-17s. And he took command of the B-17s at Langley after being, he was a pursuit pilot in World War I and then an instructor pilot, and went to Langley and was part of that whole group at Langley that were promoting air power to the government. He was Billy Mitchell's aide all the way through the trial. He was Curtis LeMay's commander. Hap Arnold, Tui Spots, Eddie Rickenbacker, Elliot White Springs, all those names were his buddies. These are the people my dad grew up around. How could you not be a pilot growing up around these guys? So Robert, and there was my grandmother, Eloise. Robert met Eloise when he was stationed in Hawaii right after World War I. And they married there, and Robin was born in Hawaii. So grandfather Robert, in his B-17, he was actually the commander of 13 of them total after they were flown from Boeing here. He flew them back and forth across the country and down to South America and did a whole bunch of goodwill tours down to South America to prove the long-range capability. I have to point it out here. There's his Major General photograph. And he passed away as a Major General at the age of 46, a month before my dad graduated from West Point. He had just received a new combat command assignment from Hap Arnold, but it was in 1943, and it was very stressful time, and he got sick, he got pneumonia, and died. So my dad was born at Luke Field in Honolulu, and we call this his first set of wheels. Then they moved back to Langley, and he spent from 1925 to 1939 on the grounds of Langley. I was just there in late January, and I'm going back to start researching my grandfather's book because the archives are really filled with his documents. So it was really stunning for me because Langley itself really hasn't changed. When you go on the base, it's all the same old brick buildings. So I was standing in front of the house where my grandfather and father lived from 1925 to 1939. And it was a little emotional.
He's on the right or on the left? Which one is it?
He's on the right in the photograph. That's his younger brother, Stephen, on the left. And so Daddy went to West Point, basically with a class in 1944, but the war had started. And so what they did was they shortened the classes into 3 years without cutting anything out. They kept everything that they had to study for 4 years crammed into 3. Not only that, he was playing football. He was an All-American tackle at West Point. In fact, he's the only man who's in the Football Hall of Fame and the Aviation Hall of Fame. And they was also taking pilot flying lessons. So can you imagine the schedule that those boys kept up with in those days? Quite astonishing. I have to figure this thing out. All right, and there's Robin in the back. Grinning. I love the young man on the left. Looks like the buttons are going to burst right off of his uniform. I think I'm going to have to go to a manual. So pilot training. This was actually while he was at West Point. And then right after West Point, he came out to California and trained in the P-38. And then the whole squadron, the 434 Squadron, all knows, went over together to England, to Wattisham, in May of 1944, and got there about a month before D-Day. So here's the squadron. Out of 25 pilots in the squadron, only 9 came home. And there's Robin with his training P-38. And you'll see the letters CAT, which actually is SCAT, up on the fuselage. Here's another one of him with his P-38. There are 7 flying P-38s in the world right now, but you've been flying one, you better be careful. You take care of that thing. And they've just, the Fagan Fighters Museum, World War II Museum, has just repainted their P-38 as SCAT-3. And it debuted at Oshkosh this summer, and it flew with the F-22 and a Mustang and an F-4. Pretty astonishing. So there he is in August. So Daddy flew 3 missions over Normandy on D-Day. Wrote beautifully about it in his diary, and a lot of that is transcribed directly in the book. It's quite a moving passage. In August of 1944, Hub Zemke took over the squadron and brought the Mustangs with him. And so he started flying Mustangs. And there he is with SCAT-5. Now, Scat Davis was the name of his roommate at West Point. And he dearly wanted to fly, but he washed out of pilot training because he was colorblind, and he was heartbroken. So Robin said, "Don't worry, Scat, I'm going to take you flying with me my whole career." And he painted Scat on every one of his airplanes. Scat-27 is sitting in splendor at the Museum of the Air Force in Dayton. It's the F-4 in which he shot down 2 of his 4 MiGs in Vietnam. It's a really stunning display. But Scat flew with him the whole time. And so Scat, here's Scat-6. I'm actually going to go get to fly Scat-7 in Belgium at the end of April. My daughter and I are being flown over there by the guys who bought Scat-7, which is the original. Refurbished it, and it's been flying in air shows all across Europe. And they're putting on a big event to honor Robin and for the Mustang, and to introduce the people in Belgium to the Mustang. And so my daughter and I are flying over. I think that'll be a little fun. So at the age of 22, when the squadron commander was shot down, Robin became the squadron commander, 22 and a major. Can you imagine that? And during his time in World War II, he shot down 13 enemy aircraft and destroyed another 12 on the ground, I believe it was. Came home after World War II and had a very interim assignment as assistant football coach at West Point, which he thought was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of. He lasted with that for about 4 months. And then he got in his convertible and blasted down the Pentagon and pulled every string he could and said, "I want to fly the new jets. Send me to California." So out he came to March Air Force Base and started flying the P-80, the Shooting Star. And with his favorite group of pilots, they formed an aerobatic team that took the P-80s back and forth across the country, and they would barnstorm from one end of the country to the other. Can you imagine if you're in Lincoln, Nebraska, and you've never heard the sound of a jet, and suddenly 4 things roar over the city and land at the local airport? Well, they would land, they would circle, and they would land and stay on the ground for maybe 2 hours and sign autographs and take photographs, and then take off for the next city. So this group right here is basically the start of the Thunderbirds, first aerobatic team in the Air Force, and the Navy had their team going on at the same time that was developing. I love this shot of him in front of it. People have asked me, so when the movie's made, who's going to play Robin? I have no idea. I haven't seen an actor yet who would have his charisma. He was 6'2" and sandy blonde hair and hazel eyes and a deep voice and a graceful swagger. I wish George C. Scott were still with us. Maybe he could do it. I'm open to suggestions if anybody has an idea. But while he was in England, as happens, they would send over movies from Hollywood, and all the boys would gather in the Quonset huts and watch these movies as the air raid sirens were going on. And there was this one young actress that caught his eye, named Ella Raines. And when he came back to California, he finagled a blind date with her through a friend that knew her secretary. And Ella, at the time, had been in about, I don't know, up to that point, about 20 movies, and one of them with John Wayne, Tall in the Saddle. She was actually dating Clark Gable when she met my dad. Dumped Clark Gable. Married Robin 9 months later. And when they got married, he warned her, he said, look, Ella, I know you're a movie star, but I'm a fighter pilot. And I am always going to be a fighter pilot. And I have to warn you about that because my life is about being a fighter pilot. So if you're willing to put up with that, come on, let's go. So they got married, and the first assignment was back to England, where Robin became the very first RAF Squadron 1 commander, an exchange officer. As an American, he commanded RAF Squadron 1. It was his favorite year over in England. Look at all the meteors lined up behind him. And part of my trip in late April, early May, is we have been invited over to Scotland, where RAF Squadron 1 base up in Scotland has just opened the Robin Olds bar. So we're going to go, my daughter and I are going to go and, how do you say it, pour a little there in that bar. And so after the RAF, he came back to the States and was base commander, ops commander at Pittsburgh. And Mother was living in New York City because she was acting in a couple of TV shows. But I love this photograph. This is the quintessential how much Robin Olds loved a desk job photograph. And those papers, and I actually have some of the papers, and of course you have to write reports all the time, and more reports and more reports. And he was told by his squadron commander, you submit a report every day for what's going on. Well, there was nothing going on. And so what Daddy would do is he would get out a piece of paper and write, 0400, mouse ran across the floor. 0405, looking for mouse traps. Opening file birds, looked in Tommy's desk, shouldn't have done that. Found mouse traps. 0508, set 3 mouse traps. 0515, first mouse trap snap. And he would fill pages and pages and pages. And we should well, he got the report done, right? He did that throughout his career in one form or another. This is really funny. And so we were living in New York City, and that's me with the hair on the right. And my sister Susan lives in North Bend. I'm actually going to see her today. It's her birthday today. Yeah, which is really neat how this worked out. My mother suffered from that disease of women in the 50s that insisted on dressing their children just like themselves. And every little outfit we had was just a copy of her outfit. Little dresses, raincoats, riding outfits, ski outfits, little velvet dresses for parties, and she would have the grown-up version. My mother dressed my sister and myself alike all the way through our childhood, and in fact, Susie and I were so grateful to be sent to boarding school when we were 15 and 16. But when we got there, we realized that we both had to wear the same uniforms. It's a standing joke with us, and I'll show up today and she might be dressed just like I am for some reason. We don't even coordinate it. So after New York, we went back over to Europe, this time to Wheelus Air Force, a little bit in London, and this time to Wheelus Air Force Base, where he was setting up the weapons school. I don't have many photographs from Libya. I think they're just in a bunch of slides I haven't had developed yet, but there aren't many of him actually on site. He did start a car club, had Porsche races, and he also started a football team so that all the pilots that were stationed over in Europe would come down once a month and play football in the sand with him. But after Libya, we went back to Washington, D.C., where he had to do his penance in the Pentagon for 5 years. And also during that time, I don't have many photographs of him in the Pentagon. It was not a happy time for him. He really struggled with bureaucracy all through his life. But I do have photographs of what he did away from the Pentagon. So we'd sail in the Chesapeake, we'd come to Wyoming and ride, we'd ski. Anything he could. He played squash every day at the Pentagon to get the stress out and just to keep himself sane. And during that time, he was very much against nuclear weapons. He was really struggling with all the plans for the nukes that everybody was pushing in the Pentagon. He had to write many, many papers about them. And I know he hated them, which was surprising to me later. He got sent right after the Pentagon and the War College over to England, where he was the wing commander of the 81st Fighter Wing at Bentwaters Woodbridge, twin bases, and flew the F-101. During that time, of course, this is 1963, and Vietnam was just kicking off and really heating up, and he wanted to get over to Vietnam and be a combat pilot again. But they told him, no, you're on the list to get your general star. You're not going to go fly again. You're not going to fly combat again. Forget it. But Robin wanted to get back to combat. And so he had an idea that the way to do that was to get himself in trouble. And he did. So these 4 guys, his 3 guys, are with him here at Bentwaters. These 3 guys ended up with him in Vietnam. But the way they did it is every base has an open house once a year when you invite all the villagers around to come onto the base, and you have a little air show. Well, Daddy decided, well, I'm going to put on an air show like they've never seen. So he got these 3 pilots and himself in their 101s, which, as you know, the Voodoos are not designed to be aerobatic, really. And they'd go off the coast and practice. Well, that day, and I was on the ground, we were thrilled on the ground because these 101s would roar in from opposite directions and do a bomb burst up through the middle. They'd come in upside down low over the runway, broke a whole bunch of windows on base, made a whole lot of noise. We loved it. Well, the next day, he got hauled into his commanding general's office, who said, it was beet red apparently, and he said, "You are never going to be a general, and I'm ripping up your promotion papers right now." And he ripped them up in front of it and threw them down. He said, "And you're exactly the kind of officer we're going to ship off to Southeast Asia." And my dad said, "Yes, sir, thank you, sir." and turned around and walked out. But of course they had to punish him for a year, so he got sent to 9th Air Force at Shaw Air Force Base. Just for a year, but also during that time he was training in the F-4 out at Davis-Monthan. Here's the 101 cleverly disguised against the English landscape. And this is a photograph of that actual day. Somebody sent me this photograph last year, and here are the 4 of them in flight.
Oh, wow.
So, 1965 at Shaw Air Force Base, and then the next year, late September 1966, he got shipped off to Southeast Asia and became the wing commander of the 8th TAC Fighter Wing at Ubon in Thailand. This is when he arrived. And when he walked onto that base, there was tremendous demoralization of all the pilots. The 105s were constantly getting knocked down out of the skies. The squadrons and all the bases were squabbling with each other. There was not just competitiveness, it was nitpicky squabbling. Morale was really, really low. And he walked in and he took over this base. The first day, he walked into the briefing room and strode up through all the pilots sitting there slouched over. He strode up to the front and he stood and he stared at them, which is often how he would start his speeches even later. He would just stare at people in the room and started off by saying, "I am a fighter pilot." And I'm always going to be a fighter pilot. So you youngsters in here, you better train me well, because I'm going to be leading you over Route Pac 6 in 3 weeks. And one of the young guys said, yeah, right. And my dad looked at him and said, and you are going to be my wingman. And he was. That was J.B. Stone. Pretty soon, Robin was leading them in about 10 days, leading them in combat. The old man, 45-year-old full-bird colonel, flying and leading them. And pretty soon, oh, come on. This has a mind of its own. In December, he was joined by Chappie James, and Chappie had been Daddy's vice wing commander over at Memoirs. And I grew up with Chappie's kids, and they were great friends. So, and he came over as his vice wing commander, and they remained great friends to the end of Chappie's life. Now, Chappie wasn't known to be a great fighter pilot, but he was a great person. He was a people person, and that's why he became our first 4-star African-American general, and is loved by many people. And talk about, this man was even bigger than my dad. So the two of them together were quite a force. They would often try to come through a doorway together. And their shoulders would get stuck. But because of the how many aircraft were being lost, the MiGs knew, the North Vietnamese MiGs pilots knew that they weren't going to come up after the F-4s. They were going to come up after the 105s. So if the F-4s showed up, the MiGs would disappear. So Robin and J.B. Stone got together and said, we have got to figure this out. We have got to get those MiGs up. And they came up with a plan, sort of a Trojan horse plan, to disguise the F-4s as if they were 105s. And they changed the radar, or they changed the armament, they changed the call signs, they changed how they flew, when they flew. They followed the whole pattern that had been set before of how the 105s were flying. And they came, and it was called Operation Bolo. And Operation Bolo launched on the 2nd of January, 1967. And first it was cloud cover, and they thought, oh, they're not going to come up. But sure enough, the MiGs came up, and within 10 minutes, they knocked down 7 of them, which turned out to be over a third of the North Vietnamese Air Force at the time. So it came home, and that's when Robin got her first MiG that day. When they came home, this is their landing, their arrival back at Ubon. And stepping out of the plane with J.B. Stone, J.B. got his first MiG that day as well. He's a wonderful friend to this day, lives in San Antonio, always goes to the Fighter Aces things. Then meeting his commanding general, who was there right after Bolo. And this, and then there's JB, who had already changed into his party suit. That was really interesting because January 2nd, 1967, or January 3rd actually, was the first day back at school for my sister and me in Washington, D.C. And we came out of our door that morning to catch our school bus, and our lawn was covered with reporters. I had no idea what had happened. And a very famous anchorman of the day, I recognized him from television, came up and stuck a microphone under my face and said, "How do you feel about your father being a murderer?" That was the sentiment of the times. We had no idea what happened. My sister burst into tears. I kept saying, "What, is he all right? What happened to my dad? Is he all right?" And we got surrounded by reporters, and the bus driver got off the bus and put his arms around us and got us on the bus, took us to school. We went right into the headmistress's office where we stayed the whole day because the airwaves were just abuzz with this huge aerial battle that had happened in North Vietnam led by our dad. But I will never forget the experience of being asked that and not knowing what had happened. And so to this day, I will go around and I will talk to Vietnam veterans as much as I can and welcome them home because you were terrible. When he landed back at Andrews in October of '67, we were in a staff car that came out of Andrews, and apparently there was a march on the Pentagon happening that day, and we had to drive right through the protesters that were everywhere, and the car was spat upon and rocked and pounded upon. And I'll never forget my dad with his jaw working in the corner and tears coming down his face saying, "What has happened to my country? What has happened to my country?" Now we appreciate our kids over there. We appreciate all of them. We welcome them home with open arms. But I think we still have a lot of catching up to do for the Vietnam guys. So you have my thanks. All right, so on we go. Whoop, I reversed it. So right after Bolo, Robin decided to grow a mustache. And his first motivation was to copy Tommy Burns from the RAF Squadron 1. Tommy Burns, who had one leg, was still a pilot, had a big mustache. And so Robin started growing this mustache. But pretty soon it grew out of limits and out of limits and out of limits. And there were probably several generals who made a flight over to Vietnam and told him to shave it off, shave it off, shave it off. But Robert McNamara was doing his thing back in the Pentagon. And so Robin decided that this mustache was going to be his single-digit salute to Washington, D.C. And to this day, the Mustache March is going on right now. General Welch last year sanctioned Mustache March in honor of Robin. It's been going on for 20, 30 years. Active duty kids around the world will grow their mustaches. And I go off, next week I'm headed off on my mustache judging trip that I do every year. I go to different bases and I judge them. Which is pretty funny, no one's growing them out of limits these days. But so this mustache grew and grew and grew. One of the big reasons, if not the major reason, that my dad was so loved was not just his skills as a fighter pilot, it was more his skills as a leader. And he wasn't really a leader per se, he was just himself. And the way he was himself and became a good leader in the process was he really honestly loved people. He loved the men who served with him and flew with him. And every time he got to a new assignment, the first thing he'd do would be throw his bags down the BOQ and go meet everybody. He'd go to the barbershop and the hospital and the BX, and he'd prowl around base and introduce himself. He'd take a 6-pack of beer out on the flight line at 3 in the morning when the youngsters were working on airplanes in the middle of the night and sit with them and say, tell me what you guys need. What are the problems? What aren't you getting? I've got your back, I'll order your supplies for you, I'll make sure you're taken care of. He learned all their names, he learned their children's names, all the birthdays, and just started connecting with people that way. Well, you can imagine that just sucks a whole group together. The morale, I get chills when I talk about this. The 8th Fighter Wing, the morning of Bolo, at the briefing right before they took off, my dad said, go get them, Wolfpack. And that's when he renamed the 8th Fighter Wing as the Wolfpack. And to this day, the 8th Fighter Wing, which is now at Kunsan in South Korea, it moved up there in the mid-70s, is at the forefront of leading the defense of South Korea against the crazy man up north. And I went there last April, and that whole base is about the Wolfpack. They invited me over, they were renaming everything. It's the Robin Olds Avenue, and the Robin Olds Room, and the Wolfpack Lodge, and the Wolfpack Wheels, and every airplane has Wolfpack, has a symbol of the wolf and WP on it. And I have to think my dad is still flying with them. I'll tell you what, it started right there. Okay, so he was also a great jokester, and he was gifted this monkey. I won't tell you its name, it's very politically incorrect at the time. I can't.
Tell us, you can do it.
I can do it?
In this
well,
group?
when
Yes.
Chappie came over, Chappie and Robin together were known as Black Man and Robin. And they still, I mean, people talk about them this way. Well, Daddy named this monkey Stokely Carmichael. Yeah. But what he would do is he would turn this monkey loose in pilots' rooms when they were out on missions. And you know, monkeys are really destructive, and it basically would tear everything apart. And then he took it into the officers' club and he'd set it loose where it would run up and down on the table, stick its fists into drinks and nuts, and run up and down the bottles behind the bar, and the little Thai waitresses would run screaming out of the O Club. And then one day when Daddy was out on a mission, some guys unlocked the double-locked cage that was next to his trailer on the flight line and set the monkey loose in his trailer. When he got back, there was nothing left intact. There was excrement smeared all over the walls. Things were ripped, his flight suits were ripped, he had to borrow flight suits. And the monkey ended up in a zoo the next day. So here he is having an impromptu staff meeting with Chappie on the hood of his staff car. in the planning room. Daddy loved maps. He was a historian, absolutely addicted to history. As a little kid, he would sit on the edge of my bed and ask me if I wanted Europe or Asia that night. And I'd go, okay, or Europe. And he'd start naming all the kings of every country from, the year 1000 all the way up through current. He knew all that history. He could name every pharaoh. He could name all of the Ming Dynasty people. It was amazing. But he loved maps. So he was always in the map room at UBAN, helping them plan their missions and trying to figure out where everything was that they had to be careful about.